Okie dokie. Welcome to this week as we talk about race and ethnicity. Sorry again that I have a late video. Just my weekend was crazy full. So hope you had a good weekend and an extra hour. Let's talk a little bit more as we delve into the different distinctions that cause stratification, that are evidence as far as how we stratify, and race and ethnicity, of course, is something that we can't shy away from. W. Du Bois, WEB, is one of my favorites when it comes to helping us understand the importance of understanding this categorization. As earlier stated in our study of theorists, he helped us with double consciousness, and of course his great credit as an early scholar in sociology, but also in America, as a person of color who graduated with such distinction from Harvard and all the things that he's done. So he said this at once, and this may not seem the most apt quote, but I want you to think about it for a second. When you've mastered numbers, you will in fact no longer be reading numbers any more than you read words. When you're reading books, you will be reading meanings. And this is what we're doing with all of these categories, is that numbers do matter. They tell us something. You know, why is it that gender and race and ethnicity and culture and socioeconomic background and all of these types of things play such a big part in our life experience? And are we trapped by those, or are there things that we can do to recognize and name how we've done this and construct something different? And how do we do that? And WEB would say with numbers is how we first get the understanding of that. But we're going to first start with a couple descriptions, and your videos this week are, please watch the ones, oh gosh, all of them are really good, so please just give them a view because they're not that long. The one talking about ethnicity on campus, what is ethnicity, what is race, and also talking to white people, because a lot of times we don't look at that as a race. We see that as a kind of ground zero sometimes, and then shade people off of that whiteness, and that's a major issue. So white people have to be able to talk about race as well if we're going to make other populations, or if other populations in the world have to. Ethnicity, so let's go back to that. Ethnicity is the cultural value and norms that distinguish the members of a given group from others. Members are pretty aware of this cultural connection. It doesn't always have to do with nation state, which is something that we typically do. Skin color is not always how ethnicity is expressed, because there can be cultures that are religious. For example, Jewish folks consider themselves part of an ethnicity. Ethnicity is also sometimes, mixed with understanding race, because we haven't really gotten to a place where we fully know how to talk about the two. But we tend to make race more about physical characteristics, and ethnicity being much more cultural. So in some ways, I often say my ethnicity is shaped a lot by my Kansanness. To be Kansan in the world of the United States is very different than being a Texan or being a Nebraskan. You may not think of that as a form of ethnicity, but there are things that we do and cultural values that we hold. Our large part of our world may have an agricultural leaning, but there also might be particular religious leanings and political leanings and different kinds of things. Now, I'm not saying that everybody experiences that as Kansan, the same thing, but there's a uniqueness to the setting. And then to think about ethnicity in ways that is shaped by your traditions. That's important for you to consider. Then when we talk about race, we're often then talking about physical characteristics. I would check off the white box typically. I think it's really interesting when you look at a survey, how often it will say African American or Asian American, and there's a lot of times where it's like, well, then why wouldn't we have European American be the distinct category for whiteness? Because Black is sometimes used. We just don't have a clear distinction in how we do these, and we argue about it and connect on the large sociological fields. The census is one of our places that we look for that as well, to see what the differences are. But race is often about that physical characteristic, and I guess the skin color is a typical one. But there's a lot of people who are white that have very different experiences as well, and they're different shades. There's a lot of shading stuff going on that people are looking at, you know, the whiteness, the lightness, the darkness, and how race is categorized, even subcategorized there. So it's kind of an interesting thing when you think about your race and ethnicity. How would you see yourself, and what category do you fit into? And then you have to ask this question: do we need race? I mean, people are like, what purpose has it served? And of course, we know there's a great history of what we call unequal power and unequal distribution, and a lot of it has used the category of race to determine the value of people, just like we use gender and sex. And so why do we use this to categorize ourselves? Our experience is really categorized by our skin tone, and I can see lots of different arguments on both sides. Yes, but what does it need to be? What do we want it to be is another question. So we think about the theory of racial formation. How are we creating this? And it is a created group. It's changed a lot. People have said, oh, we've had racism since the beginning of time. And it's like, well, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think there have been many times and centuries where people's color of their skin or biological characteristics have not been the reasons why people are discriminated against. Sometimes it's been religious, sometimes it's been region, sometimes it's been tribal. I think it's an interesting question when people ask that. So theory of racial formation would say the process is economic and political, and the forces that are part of that create important racial categories where we do see distinction, and we see difference in income, and we see that there are major implications attributed to what a person looks like based on race, and sometimes on ethnicity, depending on where that role plays out. Therefore, racialization is a process which with the understanding of race, and it's used to classify individuals in groups of people. Racial distinctions are more than ways of describing human difference. They're also important factors in the reproduction of patterns. And so for us to even think, I wonder what it's like to be a different race than we are, or a different ethnicity, and the power and the inequality that comes with the images that are created by thinking that. That means that we see that human difference, and a lot of people are coming to terms with the fact that we have created this societally, and these factors are reproduced, and we need to look at those. What do we want to produce? What would it look like if we had different expressions of how individuals classify or are classified? It's a tough thing in the science world, because we'd have to do a lot with our variables, but it is something that we have to consider. One of the early forms of trying to validate race, and there's an interesting thing out there for you to know. It is more likely, for example, if you had an organ donor, to receive an organ donor's an organ from a donor that is not the same race as you. That's just how, but for a long time, scientific racism, especially in the early industrial age, and between, you know, what I'd call the late 1880s to the early 1920s, we saw a lot of scientific racism being used to research data that would justify and reify beliefs about superiority or inferiority of racial groups. We certainly saw this during the slave trade and colonialization. We saw a ton of this in Nazi Germany as well, where people were, you know, measured, or their characteristics, or people talked about their brain, or, you know, each thing. So one brain was more superior than another, and this is all trying to say it's scientific, and it's not. We are finding more and more that this is something that was used to keep those racist patterns in play. And therefore, it became something of a cause to study racism itself, the attribution of characteristics of superiority or inferiority to a population sharing certain physically inherited characteristics. And I don't know about you about the whole DNA movement, but, you know, my dad did his side, and it was kind of a gift. And what we found out, of course, is, you know, some things that we did know. There was, you know, connection to the English UK region, to the Scandinavian region, and to the German region. Then there were other areas, the Iberian Peninsula, down by Turkey, and areas in the Middle East that we saw, you know, large familial traits that had been passed down. And then, of course, the very first part of our destination was from Africa, because basically all of the life that we know as far as human existence, or current human existence, is based in that mid-African region. And so it was interesting to look at that and to realize how we've created this thing called racism. But things have mostly been about physical characteristics, regions, and different types of things, and assuming that that was a natural thing, but we actually create it. Institutional racism then is something that reifies out of the reflection of groups continuing to embed that racism. It's patterns of discrimination based on ethnicity that have become structured into existing social institutions. And I know it's hard for you to think about, maybe at times back into the 1950s, but, you know, here in Kansas, one of the biggest, most important law suits and cases was defined, and that I also have a video too, which is Brown versus Board of Education. And if you haven't been able to go to Topeka and see that National Historical Site, I think it would be worth your time. It's free, and you see a segregated life, and you see this experience of being put into two separate spaces, and it's all about the color of your skin. And that's institutional. It got so embedded that it was in our educational systems. And then at the same time, we were saying, oh, but people can receive that same amount of resource to get to the American dream, and it just wasn't true. Statistically, that division made a difference. Now, there's lots of different ways in which we look at race and ethnicity and how we do harmful things with that. And we have to be able to distinctively understand the different definitions there. First, all of us have prejudice. We are all experiencing prejudice of some sort because it's opinions and attitudes that we've been taught. And therefore, we hold a preconceived idea about certain things. And we have to sometimes be exposed to other groups and other places to be able to deal with that prejudice. But prejudice isn't just about race. It can be about religious groups. It can be about even schools. You know, there's a prejudice in certain families to go to K-State and a prejudice toward KU. There are times where prejudice comes out in very harmful ways in very simple environments where people get highly competitive. But it's important for us to recognize prejudice is an attitude, and it's not necessarily something that's acted upon. So we hold those inside, and sometimes we can even feel guilt when we recognize the prejudice, we're not dealing with it. So I invite you to think about, you know, what prejudices do you have? What are things that you have thought were stereotypes that were true and maybe had to deal with? Discrimination, on the other hand, is the actual behavior where that person is acting and the members or individual of a particular group, resources and rewards can be attained by others you're discriminated against. And so, for example, if a person that is as equally qualified is of a different race or ethnicity, and one race or ethnicity is considered you know, for the job, and it's all about that racial ethnic component that gets that person that job, and especially we see this, you know, even though I know people have to deal a lot of times with understanding equitable hiring processes that understand that certain races and ethnicities have had more discrimination than others, and historically we can see that to be true. We have to recognize, what are the patterns of the culture that are doing the hiring, and is there discrimination going on? But it is a deliberate act, and a lot of times it is where one person is absolutely denied the resource or reward based on their race and ethnicity. And that can be in jobs, that can be in loans, buying cars, being able to secure a house, all of these things. So that's a big thing that we have to be up and against. And then secondly, we have to recognize our stereotypes. We have a lot of times a fixed and flexible category about what people of other races and ethnicities and what people in our own race and ethnicity are all about. And we sometimes live up to our stereotypes, and sometimes we socialize those. Sometimes, though, we are really more harmful with them, applying them to other people before we actually know them and understand them. So we have to be aware of our own idea of that. And then what we call that when we transfer our ideas onto other groups is displacement. We displace that from our idea of what we think is true onto, and we treat those groups as objects, not as people. And we have to be aware that we do that a lot. Sometimes our jokes, sometimes our language, sometimes our expectation before we actually get to know a person. We are often displacing a lot of stereotypes on them. And we may be also being displaced. People may be putting those upon us. And it's important for us, if we want to change those, to be aware of it and start to change it. Otherwise, we do other things like this where we start to create scapegoats. That's just because that person's that type of person. It's who they are. They were raised that way, and we start to label. And if you remember from crime section, we talked about labeling theory. People take that to heart, and then it starts to almost seep in, and that's what society does. And we expect so much for people to step back from that and be able to have the power to do that. But if you don't have the resources or support, it's really hard to be able to not change those patterns of experiencing that displacement, or at least not have it affect you. Scapegoats then are those individuals or groups where they're blamed for wrongs, not of their own doing. And so a lot of times, think about it this way, a window gets broken in a community. And they say, oh, those boys, those gang members, they were the ones that did it. Well, did you see that? No, but we know it was. Or if people start to scapegoat a person in a group project, and that person happens to be a female, and I'm going back to gender there, but it's like, oh, if we just didn't have that woman on our team, or if we just didn't have this, or if you hear that kind of language, that's scapegoating. There's large incidences of scapegoating that get blamed on large groups of people, and especially, again, I bring up things like Nazi Germany and places where we see genocide across the globe, where we see entire groups become the blame of the problem, when we know at the core of it there's a lot of stereotyping and discrimination going on. And therefore we see also a lot of times a minority and a dominant group start to exist, and typically this is experienced in pure demographics, to know that there is a categorized group that's not as large as another group. That's the typical way we look at that. Is a minority group does not necessarily have to be determined by their race or their ethnicity. It could be a political, there's a minority group of Democrats in the state of Kansas because the majority group is Republican. So knowing those types of things this definition doesn't always apply to these cultural aspects and to these racial aspects that we've created. However, what we do tend to see is that we do have lower populations of minorities in the United States. Right now, we're sitting at 64% on white population, and so we are aware that the dominant group at this point is considered white, but then there's lots of different levels in that. So the minority group is a group of people who are in a minority in a given society and who, because of distinct physical or cultural characteristics, find themselves in situations of inequality with that society. We tend to see that with minority groups. They don't have the same amount of power and just by sheer numbers. Then the dominant group is the opposite. It's the dominant group that possesses more wealth, power, and prestige, and tends to be more representative of the larger group of society that is represented. The rise of ethnic antagonism and racism, again, goes back to our understanding of colonialism and European expansion and what we call the dichotomies, the things that were created as opposite of good and bad. And so we attended to a society that put these titles of good and bad into opposition colors, opposition experiences, white versus black. You'll hear a lot of times the white knight or the dark avenger, and there's different kinds of attitudes that are put on that very coloring of that system that don't necessarily, we don't think it seeps in, but it does. A lot of times we, think of lightness and whiteness in a more positive way, and we think of black and darkness in more negative ways, and that's because of these residues of putting some sort of validity behind this racism for such a long time. And that happened during that colonial era, and some people say we still have not gotten out of that. I think we are, it is true, there's a lot that we are still dealing with as a result of colonialism and slavery. Civil versus native, it's interesting that we highly, think civilization is this progressive modern thing, and yet many times we can look back in history and study anthropologically, and of course there weren't perfect seasons, but it could be documented that some of our most civilized societies have the most sick people and most amount of racism and discrimination and gender inequality, and that there were certain native tribes that actually lived more peacefully and had more respect for the roles that people played, and maybe even were more healthy, even if they had come across diseases or things like that, and didn't maybe have modern technology. There were other ways in which they got through that. So it's interesting that civil and native, it was so important for us to make that distinction. And then, of course, when you hear things like forward or backward, forward from what? Backward from what? What does that mean? Who has the power in saying what that is? It can get to a place where, obviously, we see entire groups and majority groups take out minority groups through genocide. They kill and they try to destroy with a system of planned destruction, typically based on racial or political or cultural ethnic groups being targeted. And so we see this happen in the world on a regular basis. It's not something that stops. In fact, we see large amounts of genocide. And if you look in world news, you'll probably see wars, and a large portion of that war is intended to wipe out a particular racial, political, or cultural group. And so that's when we get to the largest form of our discrimination. But another way in which we still continue to see issues of problem is not necessarily that people kill, but they segregate. They separate in the practice of keeping racial and ethnic groups physically separate. Maintaining that superior position is something that continues to be something we see on a worldwide basis as well. And it reminds us again of kind of a caste-like system where we see people born into these racial ethnic categories, and as if they cannot be with or intermingle with or be seen differently because they were born into that group. So we do see lots of integration that does go on, and we're in a generation right now where integration is happening at many different levels. Intermarriage is one of the major ways in which we see that. We also see this through integration of, you know, people working on a global scale, and so their exposure to different groups and different experiences people integrates. And so I often tell people integration isn't just about marrying somebody. Sometimes it's about food. Think about how many places you like to eat and where those originally, what is American food? Is it just steak and burgers and hot dogs? Or is it something made of tacos? And is it made of Chinese and food and going to Middle Eastern restaurants? And so integration happens in lots and lots of different ways. First, there's assimilation, where the acceptance of the minority group by a majority population happens, and the new group takes on the values and norms of the dominant culture, meaning you're trying to become more like that dominant group. So, for example, if you chose to move to China right now, or if you chose to move to Japan, if you wanted to assimilate, you'd take on the cultural traits of the community, you would take on the practices, you would try obviously to take on the language, and these are forms of assimilation to try to blend in and be part of that group. There's another way in which people integrate, though, which is called the melting pot, and this is where ethnic differences can be combined to create new patterns of behavior, drawing on diverse cultural sources. And I think of it like this. Once again, going back to the food idea, instead of having a place where you go for a taco, you might go for an Asian taco, which blends two different things that are combined, and you create something new. Obviously, Asian communities might have had something that looked like a taco, but maybe not, and maybe the Hispanic communities with their foods of tortillas could have had, you know, sweet and sour General Tso's chicken, but when you put those two things together, it becomes a new thing, and it makes food truck life very happy. So a melting pot is more where you kind of take, but you don't really see the distinction. You see a new blending of something, whereas pluralism is a model of coming together, assimilating in where ethnic relationships and groups in society retain their independent, separate identities that share equally in rights and powers of citizenship. And this is where I want you to think again of the food that we were thinking about. And let's say you're going to a large city, and in that city, you know that there's a Greek town that has lots of Greek restaurants, or a Chinatown that has lots of Chinese restaurants, or a Hispanic town. These are pluralistic lives where people are living side by side, typically maintaining their ethnic identity. That makes some of the joy of going to these spaces fun, because it feels like you're getting into the culture, and there's not this fusion going on as melting pot type of mentality goes on, but it's a definite pluralism where things are side by side, and you represent that sense of life and preserving that. Multiculturalism is even one more step into not just pluralism, because a lot of times pluralism, you'll still see then communities live separately and not integrate with each other very well. They may be aware of each other's existence, they may honor each other's existence, but multiculturalism is a viewpoint where ethnic groups can exist separately and share equally in economic and political life, that you're there actually trying to do this together. And so you're looking out for the good of the other culture, and you want to help maintain that, and at the same time be aware of your shared value, in that it is important that these cultures be preserved, but also that you're not separating and on your own doing that, that's the whole group recognizing that this is important to the process. of integrating. So why do ethnic groups migrate? A lot of times it's labor and jobs and work and how we set up the world, and lots of things that we ourselves can't even come to understand as countries develop and corporations develop, and sometimes they work in tandem and sometimes they don't. But what we know is, as laborers who are trying to survive, one of the major ways in which people for centuries, beyond millennia, have survived is to migrate, to go to places where there's jobs. And migration isn't something just about going from a different country. I tell people we have huge migration patterns all the time going on. There is an entire group of people that moved out of Chicago and Detroit after industry collapsed and moved to the South. There was a large group of people after the Civil War that moved out of the South to go to the North because it felt more safe and it felt like places where their values of abolition and understanding new free life, especially those who were freed slaves, could settle and find jobs. We saw in Kansas a community called Nicodemus that people migrated to and created for themselves, and it was more of a pluralistic piece where a community was mostly African American freed slaves. So there's a lot of ways in which people migrate, and I don't want you to just think about, in the U.S., people are migrating out of the U.S. all the time. In fact, we're hitting huge numbers right now. People don't talk about this, but of expats, people leaving to go live in Europe and Asia and Africa and parts of the Caribbean. And that's something that's happening on a global scale, is that people come in and out of countries, obviously, but people then often go in and out of their own regions within their countries. So immigration is the movement of people into one country from another for the purpose of settlement. So that is something that happens. It's different than migration. So migration is just movement. It just happens. Immigration is about a country where people are moving into one country. So people who are immigrants are people who have moved, for example, if you're thinking this way, into a country. So if a person is moving from France to Kansas, they are an immigrant, but they're emigrating from France. They're an immigrant to the United States. They're immigrating from the sending country. And in sociology, we use this all the time. What are the sending countries that we see? We had huge amounts of sending countries after World War II with Poland and Germany. We had huge settlements. Go up and look at the German settlements that happened after World War I and World War II, because we also had many internment camps after World War II. And there were large German-speaking populations that settled in Kansas and Nebraska. And that sense of immigration and immigration is, where's the country they're coming from? Where's the country they're going to? A refugee is a person who doesn't want to immigrate, but they have to. There's no other way. They have to flee their home due to the political, economic, and natural crisis. We've seen this in Syria in most recent times. We've seen this in large portions of the south of the border in Africa and the Middle East. And this is refugee situations. We've seen to a point where the wars and the zones themselves have lost any sense of political stability, that people do not feel safe. And so to protect their families, to protect their idea of being able to survive, they have to leave. That's different than a person who chooses to leave as an immigrant. Diaspora then is where an ethnic population from an original homeland will a lot of times be in exile for a really long time. Basically, they have such huge trauma that the circumstances have created whole groups moving. Once again, this is something we see in Syria. We don't see people repopulating Syria, and there may be long-term effects where people have had to relocate for long periods of time and then eventually live outside of that space, even though they didn't want to. We saw this happen with Jewish populations, and then people will say, they've lived out of that region in diaspora for a long time, even though the region of their homeland or their ethnic culture is something that they want to be part of. all of these things play into race and ethnicity, and in so many ways it can be a difficult subject. I hope that as you think through this, you are able to consider, all the different factors that have been placed upon you as far as, what you look like, and the ethnic and cultural background that you have. And also recognize that every human is, in this current system that we work in the world, is usually negotiating that. And then how can you make a difference in, some of the changes, and how can you be more aware of the ways in which we categorize and don't equally distribute or even consider equal distribution. It may not ever happen that we get equal distribution. But we have to be aware of the problem, and it definitely disadvantages other groups to a point where they're not valued. Thanks for listening. Again, text me if you need anything, 913-553-0267. Have a good week.